50s. The two most iconic figures were Walt Disney and Albert Einstein. And I was, inspired by these two people. And so I grew up loving science but at the same time loving art. I was the best artist in my school, although it was not an art school. So now seeing a lot of other artists do, I was only so-so. And I didn't see what the path was to follow that particular passion, or how I could even become better. Now, in truth, there was a path and I could have figured out, but I didn't know. So I switched over into physics, which looked like it was the easier path to go down than art. And it was in physics, in studying it, it was that time that computer science was taking off as a field. And what I realized was that this is where the frontier was. And I wanted to be at the frontier. And it would take a long time to get to the frontier of physics, but we're right at the frontier in computer science. And one of the reasons I say this, well, that is the way I thought at the time, it is still remarkable to me that 50 years later, computer science is still at the frontier. That is, when you come out as students, it's still exciting, things are changing, the new techniques, the new technology create these incredible opportunities. And just as importantly, there are some very serious problems that we've got where we need some very smart people with good ethics and good sensibilities to take their skills and help solve these serious problems that we have in the world.
Great. So the next question that we have is, what do you think computer animation will be like in 10 years? And what do you think future animators will need to know?
Well, the thing that drove me, and it's driven me for many years, has to do with human interaction, the way we work with each other. And animation or movies or books or plays, they're all ways of us teaching each other. So storytelling is a way of communicating. And we start, with a lot of us, we've got little kids in our laps or in my case, when I was a kid, my parents reading to me. And the way we tell stories and the way we communicate is a way of learning, and it's probably one of the most powerful ways that we have of learning. So the driving passion has always been, how do we be good at telling stories? How do we tell good stories? It could be, stories can also be mind-numbing, or they can take you off things. But at very best, it actually broadens our views, and I think helps us. And that's what I'd like to see. And over this last century, storytelling via media has changed fairly dramatically from the movies to television and DVDs and so forth, and now it's streaming. In terms of creating them, there are things that have always been true. The best stories have got storytellers who know how to connect with people. That's the only thing that hasn't changed. So when I look forward 10 years, the technology is going to change. All right, we still see that the speed of computers, the exponent of Moore's law really isn't actually slowing down. If you look at just what's happening with NVIDIA, machine learning, quantum computing are all either technologies that are hitting us now or coming soon, which are going to dramatically alter our abilities to communicate and tell stories. We've already seen, in some sense, the democratization of the ability to create the stories. The tools for capturing images or generating them are very readily available now. It doesn't necessarily mean the stories are better, but it means if you are good, you've got an opportunity to use these tools. We're in a situation where the technology is changing, The skill set of the people coming out of the schools is changing. The expectations of the people watching stories is changing. And the skill set of the people making the films is developing and maturing. There is nothing stable in this picture. And really, that's kind of what life is. Like, we can't grab on and say things aren't going to change. They are going to change. What do we bring to it? What do we add?
Oh, I finished my thing.
Okay, I'll talk to you. That's my son, my senior. So anyway, that's what I see coming down for the next several years is continual change. And that change can lead towards bad outcomes. Unintended consequences can be very good, and they also can be negative. So our intents matter. Your intents matter.
Thank you. Next question that we have is, can you talk about the work for which you were awarded a Turing Award?
Well, the earliest work was solving the problems of making images. When I started, images were either line drawings or they were polygonal surfaces. And the University of Utah, which is where I went to school, was one of the early schools funded by ARPA. And it was one of the first 4 nodes on what was called ARPANET, which of course became the internet. So this was this exciting time, and each student then was trying to advance the state of the art. So you would walk into a program, and your job as a student is to find the problems and fix them, make the pictures better. It was our choice as to what we wanted to do. And I wanted to figure out how to make curved surfaces. So I came up with a mechanism for displaying curved surfaces, which is the fundamental contribution in my thesis. But along the way, I came up with other things, which turned out to be more important in terms of the technology for making surfaces. And so part of the Turing Award is for that new approach for creating surfaces, as well as just being one of the people that helped drive forward in making these changes happen over the years. And when I graduated, my concept of myself was that I was a researcher and I was planning to be in academia. I love school, I love college all the way through. And that's where I want to spend my life. But when I got out, actually, it turns out that the universities at the time weren't interested in computer graphics, certainly not computer animation. It was a completely irrelevant thing to look at. So I couldn't find anybody that wanted to do what I wanted to do. So I had to park myself for 9 months until I could find somebody who wanted to invest in advancing the state of the art. And then I did back in New York. And then 5 years later, as a result of this, George Lucas hired me to bring technology into the film industry. But part of it was just being maybe stubborn about believing that something was going to happen, and that by pushing hard on it, it was going to happen. And I do believe that's the case. I think a lot of our big problems are real. That is, you can look at and say, well, there are real problems in the world, or real issues, or real challenges. You may not know how to get there. The definition of the problem may change over time, but we're continually in an interaction between the steps or the tactics or the whatever we have to do to get there, and our comprehension of what we're aiming towards. And that's an interplay. So it's a long-term interplay between that rough goal and what you have to do to get there. And so there's a kind of patience, but at the same time, there's an impatience because one needs to go through and take these steps. And it's been this actually phenomenal ride. It was 5 years in New York. I worked with amazing people. And then, and it's been Jim Clark, who founded Netscape and Silicon Graphics, came out, worked at New York Tech also. And at school, I was with also John Warnock, who founded Adobe, Alan Kay, one of the originators of object-oriented programming. We had this remarkable group of people together. And that environment was a safe one. We were encouraged. It was also a free and open environment. When I went to Lucasfilm, George was the only person in the entire film industry who had any credibility, who thought that technology was going to have an impact in entertainment. And so he was willing to invest in it. But one thing to understand is he knew nothing about technology at all. He just believed that it was going to be important, and it was that enabled him to decide that he's going to invest in it. And then we were able to, again, bring together some great people. When I got my PhD and then formed that research group back in New York Tech for computer graphics, at that time, as I mentioned, my mental concept was that I was a researcher. And it took several years before I transitioned from thinking of myself only as a researcher, and having to manage was sort of like this problem. I wish it'd go away. I liked being in charge, but I didn't like to do the work that went along with it. So I was trying to get people who were always self-motivated. And what I found was about a third of my ideas about how to manage were a complete crock. But what I also found was that at the same time that I loved physics, I loved computer science, I loved computer graphics, I found that the complexities of human interaction, how and why people do things, was also incredibly important. These weren't either or propositions. They were all exciting and they were fun, trying to figure out what's going on, why do people do things. I made some mistakes as a manager, but I also did some things I think that were right. And one of them was that we decided early on to publish everything we did. Now, the group that I was leading was not the only one that wanted to get graphics to the point where we could make an animated film. There were intellectual competitors. We were a long ways away from being able to do it, and I knew it. But the intellectual competitors, when they had a new idea, they would keep it secret because they thought it gave them some kind of advantage. And my view at the time, and still was it was a complete delusion. We were so far away that to think that we were somehow going to have a secret which is going to carry us over the line was just plain not true. And that if you understood Moore's law, then you knew that you could wait and work on other problems. And it's interesting because everyone in this field knows about Moore's law, and it's been around for a long time. And while the exponent itself may vary over time, very few people have a deep and visceral understanding of what it means in a few years as a consequence of all those changes that are coming. And as a group, we did talk about it. We were very careful about this. So we published everything. And the result was we were completely and thoroughly engaged in the computer graphics communities that we grew. I still have more friends in academia than I do in the entertainment world. That SIGGRAPH world was an amazing, stimulating place to be. And I encourage everybody to actively engage in the community that you want to be in. You get friends, you learn a lot, and you're working with other people. So that was a good thing that came out of it. And we continued it as we started Pixar. I continued to Lucasfilm. George didn't care if we published because he was just trying to benefit the industry. Here's the surprising part though. When Steve Jobs bought us from Lucasfilm to form Pixar, the company, Steve, who's known to be secretive, Steve didn't care if we published everything. Steve's very smart. There's a reason why he was secretive, and he knew what the reason was. But he also knew that we were doing something different. We had no advantage in trying to keep everything secret. What we were trying to do was to get the very best people in the industry working with us. And that meant that you had to fully engage. and participate in that community. So Steve didn't care. And likewise, when Disney finally bought Pixar, they didn't care if we published. Well, I don't think they cared. I mean, by then we were doing well, so nobody ever questioned what we were doing. But the result was that to this day, Pixar and Disney participate still broadly in this community. Actually, there's one other thing that I want to bring up about Steve is because I want to correct a misconception about him. I think I worked for Steve longer directly than anybody else. And I knew him early on, just as he was kicked out of Apple. And the behaviors that he had, which he was well known for, I saw, and they weren't particularly good behaviors, but they're kind of sexy. So people like to write about them or make movies about those behaviors. What they don't see is that Steve went through a dramatic change over his lifetime, a very dramatic change. He went through the classic hero's journey. So as you know, the classic hero's journey is, the person is kicked out of their kingdom. They wander around in the wilderness, facing a lot of obstacles, and they learn and they grow and they come back a changed person. What happened in Steve's case is Next really didn't make it, and the first version of Pixar didn't make it, and he'd been kicked out of Apple. So he was going out and he was making these mistakes, but he was learning and he was growing, and we saw these changes in him. And there came a time in his life when all this came together and he understood it and he became empathetic, and the way he worked with people completely changed. And after he went through that change, the people who were with him stayed with him for the rest of his life. And the result was that as he was nearing the end of his life and people were starting to write about him or ask about him or interview him, and I was interviewed about him, I was not going to psychoanalyze Steve. I wasn't going to talk about this arc in his life. He's alive, he's a friend, and everybody was in the same position. So that part of the story wasn't told. Now, the reason I'm telling this is some people have the conception that that behavior, which they saw in Steve when he was young, is the kind of behavior that led to this phenomena, which is Apple today. But that isn't what happened. What happened was the changed Steve, the person who learned and grew and listened. That's the person that made the Apple of today. And that's the real important lesson. It's not what's your behavior when you're young, it's how do you grow? How do you learn? Do you think about why you're doing things, what the rationale is, what your impact is going to be, and what's important? And that's the Steve that I know. Anyway, that was a long answer to your question.
Thank you for your answer. The next question we had was, if you were in college now, what are some exciting opportunities that you might want to pursue?
Well, I'm a firm believer that you don't repeat yourself. So I wouldn't go back and say, I'm going to go and do the same thing again. So I say, well, okay, what's really interesting and what's important? I already mentioned the serious problems in the world. And the fact is you can all see them. So it's not like there's any underlying secret problem, that there are environmental, there are health problems, there are problems of the air, the oceans, and the lands. There's agriculture, but there are also economic ones that we have. And it's going to take some dedication and a lot of hard work to solve these problems. And they require these creative thinking, and they require communities of people who are working together, who've got similar values in making these things happen. One way I look at it, this is a recent thing, I was very aware that what got me going in my career was I happened to be at Utah when it was funded by ARPA, and my love of the art sort of coincided with the fact that I was at Utah where they were working in computer graphics, and that first course changed the course of my life. But what was the triggering event? So if I look over my lifetime, of course, there are all sorts of big events and bad events and great things and bad things that have happened. But there was one singular event that had a dramatic change in the world, which happened in 1957. So it's 10 years into the Cold War. And I grew up as a kid in second grade. I remember doing these drills where you went out of the classroom and hung out under the coat hangers in the hallway because there was a drill for nuclear attack. All right, so this is the view of my world of a second grader. So in 1957, we're 10 years into this, when Sputnik is launched, and in a single day, everybody in the United States, from the president to teachers to farmers, know that they have the ability to launch a missile which can land anywhere in the United States. So one day, it's like this incredible hit across the head of the reality of an existential threat. And the reason I bring this incident up is there were two responses, and this is usually true with major crises. One of them is you have to address the problem at hand. It's like for us, we're in a pandemic. You got to deal with that, the reality of that, regardless of what you want, you have to deal with it. There's a second choice that you can make or you cannot make. It's a choice. And that is, what's the long-term decision that you make about how you address problems like this in the future? And so if I look at certain crises in the past, like the oil crisis of the 70s, it was clear that this was a serious problem for the world and nothing was done. So they went through the first door of react to the problem at hand, but they didn't address long-term solutions. And that's the question for any company in any situation, is not what do you do for the things that you have to do, because that takes most of the attention. But do you think about what takes place several years and what you're going to do that's different? And what happened with Sputnik was, one of the things was they launched ARPA, which was funding smart people around the United States in a variety of ways. And this is what launched the computer revolution, was this getting all these people together, even though a lot of them forgot what originated this in the first place. But what it meant was what you're doing is you're trying to aid smart people to figure out what the solutions are, and sometimes even figure out what the problems are. So that was the bracketed event that set things up for when I happened to come out of school, for which I'm grateful that that response was enabled. And now I flash forward, and I just retired, but we suddenly have another event. Like, this is the next bracket. And unlike Sputnik, which was one day, this takes place over, the seriousness sort of rolls out over many months. And we are all forced to run an experiment that we would not voluntarily have done, which is to communicate this way, which has some positives and it has a bunch of negatives. But we have no choice. We have to run this experiment. But our real question is, going forward, as we address this and people come up with the vaccines, what are we going to do? What are you going to do to address the long range problems that we've got? Because they are equally existential and they're equally important. And if we work together, and we need to, then we're more likely to have an impact in the world. And the best thing we can have is if you are engaged in solving the real problems of the world. This isn't just about, okay, can I go off and start a company and make a bunch of money? Yeah, people do that, and a lot don't do that. Can you make a difference in the world? And that's my hope, is that you would.
Question is, what would your advice be for finding your life's passion?
Well, I do think generally that you want a combination of breadth and depth. And by depth, I mean, it's worth taking something. Now, you're in classes, you're in school or something like that, but you dive really deep and you become expert in the area. It doesn't even necessarily mean that that's going to be your life path or whatever. But I do feel like there's something important for us to experience depth. And if you experience the depth, at the same time, if you're fairly broad, and that's what universities are trying to do, try to have a broad education. All right, so you take a lot of different kind of classes, and that breadth gives you a bigger base in which to choose to understand problems. And then when you find something which grabs you and you know what it means to experience depth, then you know what it means to dive in deeply into something, or to ally yourself with people who have got, you can dive deeply in the areas that are mutually beneficial. They're not the same. It's part of working with the community. And so there's that breadth and depth, which I advise everybody to try to get, is, understand something deeply, but make sure you don't get locked into a really narrow path.
Next, could you talk about who has inspired you throughout your career and what about them inspired you?
Well, in truth, I other than mentioning Einstein and Walt Disney, while I always paid attention to what was going on in the world, I didn't think for a long time in terms of who inspired me. I mean, it's kind of curious. I'm just admitting it's like a deficiency on my part. But I realized at some point, what really inspired me, and I was inspired by it, actually had to do with the environments that had several people who put it together. So when I was at Utah, there were two people who ran the program. There was Ivan Sutherland, who was also a recipient of the Turing Award, the first one in computer graphics. In fact, the only other person in computer graphics besides Pat and me was Ivan Sutherland. Incidentally, he was also head of ARPA for a year. And then Dave Evans. And they created this amazing, phenomenal environment that all of us benefited from. And it was only when I walked out, I realized that when I left, I knew I wanted to replicate it, but I want to replicate the environment. I want to say, well, actually, the reason there was something for me to want to replicate is that those two people created that and made it happen, and for which I'm grateful and I'm thankful. And then at New York Tech, there was a man that ran the school. He wanted to be the new Walt Disney. He didn't know what he was doing, but he was funding it. And so it was an odd thing where we were trying to solve problems for a goal that was illusory. But he did it, and we brought in some amazing people, and he let it happen, and he was opened, and he's now passed away. But I'm grateful for that. And then after that, it was George Lucas, and so he did something that nobody else could do, and the rest of the industry actually really poo-pooed. He didn't care. He just went and did it because he knew it was right, and he was right. And I found that inspirational. And then, of course, with Steve, it was to be with him on his journey, which I'd talked about. But I also found that he was inspirational in that he deeply understood that there was no percentage in being wrong. And what was unusual about it is that Steve didn't want people around him who just agreed with him. We had a board of directors because we were a public company at Pixar, and he only fired 2 board of directors, and the reason was they never disagreed with him. I mean, I'm serious. He just said, because we talked about it after, he said, all they're doing is just agreeing with what I'm saying. Well, that's useless. And so we had these lively discussions because that's what he understood at a pretty deep level. And I found that quite inspirational. So there were all these elements, but there was one other thing too, which is a little more complicated. When Toy Story came out, Pixar went public 1 week after the movie came out. And I've been working for 20 years on this goal. And so suddenly in a short period of time, in achieving the goal, I was now without a goal. My goal was gone. We reached it. So it took me a year to figure out what the next goal should be. There were two things I wrestled with in that period of time. I wrote both of them down when I put it in the book, but in the process of getting it done, all this editing, one of those things I wrestled with got dropped out and I didn't notice it. And I'm now supposed to be revising the book. But I will tell you what the two things are that I wrestled with for that year. The first one is what should that next goal be? And by the end of the year, I realized that the real issue was, how does one make a sustainable culture that continues to create and make things? And that became my goal at Pixar. Yes, we had people who are going to make the movies, but what's the culture like? What supports it? How do we have it so that people continue to take risks for years and years and years and do something that's different? How do you do that? What are the things that get in the way? Why is it that other people that have succeeded go off a cliff? And being very close to Silicon Valley at the time, I saw a lot of companies succeed and then do something really stupid and fall apart. So what do we do? How do we think? So that was a year to reach that conclusion and to figure out what to do and how to think about the problem. The other one, though, is a little more embarrassing, but to me, it's also a little bit deeper for me, was that once we were successful, and there was a lot of fame that came with it, I could look back at the time and say, we couldn't have got there without, we had several key creative people. So there was John Lasseter and Andrew Stanton and Joe Ranft and Pete Docter and Lee Unkrich, amazingly good people that we started off with. So I knew that was part of this. Wouldn't have happened without them. We had many technical people who wrote some of the foundational papers in computer graphics, and they're still at Pixar. They're still doing amazing work. They were part of this. Most people have no idea who they are, but they were there. And Steve was necessary and George is necessary. So I knew all of this, but I still had a nagging question that I asked of myself. And I didn't tell anybody, because I say it's kind of an embarrassing question to ask. But the question that I asked of myself was, how much of this was me? Because I'd started it. And while I knew that everybody else was part of this, I still thought, okay, how much did I do? And I wrestled with it for a year. And at the end of the year, I realized that while it might have been natural for me to ask the question, what I did realize was that needing to answer the question, or trying to answer the question, was actually an act of separation. That to say how much was of me was to try to figure out what's the dividing line between what I've done and what other people have done. And that's a divisive thing to do. It's not a good thing to do. And I say this because I've seen people go through this. Now, they'll never admit they're asked the question, but I can see they're doing that because they're trying to prove that, well, yeah, we did this as a group. I enjoyed, had a good experience, but now I'm going to go off because I got to figure out how much of it was me. So now, actually, wrong. It's like we all work together. That's the way it works, the way it should be, and that we should think inclusively and truly value what we all brought together that could not have been done by any single one of us.
An audience member asked, what would you say is special about animation when compared with other storytelling art forms? So for example, like live action movies or theater.
Well, in terms of, let's say, theater or television or books, they have their rhythm and their format, and typically masters know what it is, and masters also know when to break the rules. So there's a structure for a theatrical film, which is a 3-act structure, and that's different than it is for plays where they have a break in the middle. And every once in a while, you'll see a movie where somebody's really good and they don't follow that form, but because they know how to break it, then they break it and it becomes pieces of art. But there are these structural differences in the way you tell the story. Stories, though, are not about reality. the fact is reality is so completely and utterly complicated and intertwined that if you were to talk to, well, let's say, a large number of people at Pixar during a certain period of time about what happened, then the stories would be quite different and frequently contradictory. And if somebody were to write down what took place, the large story would be too large that it would be so large that you couldn't tell it. So you end up simplifying. So if you take something like Pixar as an example, where people have written about it, so you have writers come in, magazine reporters or people doing documentaries and so forth, they can only capture bits and pieces. But those, because they're documented in some way, they become the story, but they're not the same as the reality of having done it. That's typically true with most companies, is if they have a failure or if they have a success, then the true stories can't be completely told because you're not going to throw people under the bus, or you can't do it. You only get a certain viewpoint. So storytelling and explaining things to people is a way of abstracting what happens and trying to get the essence and pass it over. So making movies or documentaries or writing books, they're also works of art and works of skill. But animation is an art form, and it's not about reality. But even if you look at movies that are, with actors in them and on sets, they're not about reality. If I look at your videos, and I'm only seeing a few of them up here, you're typically in your rooms or your houses or in various places like that. And there's sort of crappy lighting and reflections and various stuff like that. That's kind of the reality of what you've got, right? So where you put whatever you've got, it's actually more real. Whereas if you look at a movie, the lighting is artificial. You got a bunch of people around setting up lights. The sound isn't the actual ambient sound that's in the room. It's noisy and crappy. It's all been redone for you. The music is put in. I mean, we don't typically have somebody writing a score behind us for our lives as we move through it. So movies, live action movies, aren't realistic. Now, we sometimes think they are, but they're not. And animation is just more of a full acknowledgement. It's like it's an art form. So we're not trying to be realistic. We're trying to capture the essence of something and get it into the story. So if you take, let's say, a recent example from Pixar, which was Coco, which is about Mexican culture. And how do you do it and not fall into stereotypes? It means you have to go down there and get to know the people, capture it. In fact, there's a funny thing. I was talking with somebody last week who was from Mexico, and he said that having watched so many movies about Mexico made by Americans, that the thing that always set him off was that the things that are on the hats around there that are typically in American movies about Mexico are actually Spanish hats. They're not Mexican. And our artist had actually captured the details correctly. And so he was appreciative that we got the hat right in the movie. Who knew? But the thing was, if you go down and you appreciate a culture and you try to capture it, then you're putting it into an 1.5-hour story or 100-minute long story and trying to put those pieces together in order to tell a story. And it really is an art form. So that's why I look at all of them, is what's the art behind it? Doesn't matter whether it's 2D, 3D, live action, special effects, the theater. They can go from phenomenal art, which is jaw-dropping, to just time-filling. And a lot of people like that, they want to be directors, but the real question is, how do you tell a story which has a good impact on people?
Another audience member asked, what are some of your biggest life regrets and failures?
Well, in terms of the regrets, you know, I mean, there are a few things that I wish I'd done differently, but there are a lot of things where I just made the mistakes, and I just say, well, that's just part of the growth and the embarrassment or the things that were wrong. I can say, well, okay, I wouldn't do that again. I learned from that. Although I say, I wish I'd never made the mistake. I mean, what does that mean? Like, I wish I knew what the answer was at the beginning. It's like, that isn't the way it works. So I don't actually regret much of life, but there are some things. But I do feel like I've tried to have good intentions along the way. And when I screw it up, it's usually because my intentions were not right. And so I'd have to rethink and reassess what I'm doing or why I'm doing it. In terms of failures, because that's one I've thought a lot about. And while I've written about it, I also want to be careful because there's a problem with the terminology of failure. Basically all you've gone through failures in your lives, but we have a problem, and that is there are two meanings, roughly two different meanings to failure. One of them is that when you got in school, you screwed up, you didn't work hard, you aren't smart enough. These are negative things, but even at the work level, bridges fail, relationships fail, businesses fail. And in business and politics, failures are used as bludgeons with which to harm other people. So there's a palpable aura of danger around failure. That's one of its meanings, and it's real. So we have this built into us. But there's another meaning of failure, and that's one that you also recognize, is that when you make mistakes or you do something that's wrong, you learn from them. And a lot of the things that helped you grow were as a result of your failures. And you can look back at them and say, oh, they were educational. The problem is it's almost impossible for most people to separate out the two meanings from each other because they simultaneously exist within us. And we usually don't have the luxury of calling a failure educational until after it happened. Basically, failure is asymmetric with respect to time. It doesn't matter if your failures help you grow tremendously, you can still be really afraid about this risk that you're about to take. And the thing to realize is that we need to take the risks. And if we're going to take the risk, then we need to make it safe for the failures to happen, which means we're making it safe for other people, that we become non-judgmental about other people. And if they make a mistake, then it's okay. We learn to appreciate and support other people, and our job as managers is to work on the environment, make it safe for problems to happen.
Thank you. So now we're going to transition to the open mic part of this event. So audience members, if you do have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask.
Hi, Ed. Justin here. First of all, it's such an honor as a person who dreamed of working in a field that connects art and technology since I was a kid. You have been like an inspiration and a trailblazer. My question is, in Creativity Inc., you quoted John Lasseter as saying, art challenges technology and technology inspires art. So what are some of the biggest ways you see art challenging technology today? And how might we as young CS enthusiasts contribute to that in an ethical way?
Well, I might, in a broader sense, reframe it somewhat. And that is, sometimes you've got a technical challenge or a group of people working on solving a problem, and there's a rhythm with solving problems and trying to get them out. And then there are people who want to use it, and they've got their own rhythm and their set of challenges. And the question is, among those two things, and sometimes there's more than two, is what's the impedance match between them. So, so just let me give there are three examples. One of them was when I was at Lucasfilm. Besides computer graphics, there was digital audio and video editing. The video editing editing in the film industry was done by clipping pieces of film. So the mindset of people who edited film was that they had mastered the skill and the management skill of working with these pieces of film and putting them together as they made their movie. With video editing, you're working at a lower resolution and you assemble things in very different ways. We did come up with the tools and the technology to make it so that video editing used for film was better, faster, and more economical. But the mindset of the editors was that video equals television, which is something that they want to be associated with because they're film, and they've mastered this cutting of pieces of film, then they don't particularly want to work about learning new skills using the computer or anything else like that. So even though the technology was ready, the users of it were not ready. All right, it actually took a few years before a large switch was thrown, and then everybody realized that they were far better off using this new technology. But there was a mismatch in between what one group could do and what the other could do. In the case of making animated films, we were all together, and we thought a lot about the culture. So essentially the users were our artists and our animators, and they were tightly coupled to the people who were working on their problems. And the people who were coming up with the tools were not artists or animators. And the artists and animators would ask for things, but frequently what they were asking for was solving today's problem, but it wasn't necessarily going to be useful in the 2 or 3 years that it might take to come up with the solutions to the problems. But the impedance match was that, well, they wanted solutions and they wanted to help, and the users actually understood that they might get it wrong, so they're quite willing to change what they're asked for. So if you built what they asked for to begin with, you're still going to end up in the wrong place. So you have a match between two groups, and there's this, I'd say, like a power move. I'm not saying there are things, it's like I was using impedance matching, but it's sort of like a cycle that is very powerful in advancing the state of the art, because you've got this match between different groups of people. And another example, which was a recent one, and that most people don't quite understand, and honestly, it was part of why Pat and I got the Turing Award, but it's the thing that isn't as clear. And it has to do with this very powerful driving engine that took place over many years in the interplay between computer graphics, NVIDIA, and the games industry. So here's why this is significant. Many years ago, the primary company for computer graphics was Silicon Graphics, and they were extremely successful, and they made some very serious mistakes, which ultimately did them in. But as they were making these mistakes, their engineers left. They formed a bunch of companies, and there were like 50 of these companies. One of them was NVIDIA. And the CEO of NVIDIA was Jensen Huang, who was a brilliant, bright person. And he had a cycle for his company because they were making chips. And the chips were going to go into the boards for workstations, but also into the gaming industry. So here's the way it worked. NVIDIA and the engineers would go to SIGGRAPH. Well, at SIGGRAPH, it had the state of the art, and the papers are coming out of both academia and out of entertainment, because as I mentioned, we're publishing. And by this time, most of our competitors are also publishing, because if you want to play, then you've got to go in there and participate. So the ideas were put out at SIGGRAPH. NVIDIA takes the algorithms, put them into the chips. Now, academia and entertainment were nowhere near big enough to justify the investment in making graphics chips. But the games industry is huge. So they sold all these chips into the games industry, and they made these boards, which were much faster for graphics inside the workstations. Well, now academia and entertainment has faster, better, faster machines. They come up with new and better algorithms, which are published at SIGGRAPH, which are then put into the chips by NVIDIA, funded by the games industry. And so you've got this amazing power cycle that gets, propels this change over like this 20 to 30 year long period. It's pretty amazing. And then about, I forget, number 10, 12 years ago, something like that, various people, and Pat Hanahan being one of them, who looked at these chips, which were for gaming, to say, whoa, there's a lot of power here that can be used for things other than gaming and the graphics side. So neural networks and deep learning were concepts that have been around for like 40 or 50 years, but they got stalled because they just ran out of compute power. Right? At some point, you can't try some things, you don't have the compute power. Well, now, years later, there's this immense amount of compute power in these chips, which is now available to kickstart this again. And all of a sudden, deep learning and this whole new field starts up, and it's profound, it's major in the world, it's a major thing in the world today, and it came out as an unintended consequence of this this power cycle that went on. So the whole industry changed as a result of something which is driven by the money from games. Who knew? But that's kind of the way it works, is you've got various groups, and if you get them lined up together and get the forces there, then amazing things can happen. And that's the way I just look at most of these interesting problems of today is, okay, line up your smart people, get them aligned with the problem, the users, get the users who want to participate. You can't force it, like we couldn't force in the video editing, all right? We weren't aligned. But if we're aligned, then amazing things can happen.
Wow, that was so cool. Like you found like a common ground in the games industry, and that allowed it to connect. Oh, wow.
Well, because I was watching this from the side, and then it was like last year, near the end of the year, I had dinner with Jensen and Reed Jobs, and it was actually a celebration because at Johns Hopkins, one of the professors of radiology is Elliot Fishman, good friend, longtime friend. He even saved Steve Jobs' life once, which is a separate story. But he's there at Johns Hopkins, and so the chair was named after him, and so we had a celebration dinner in Palo Alto, and so since Jensen was there, I just said to Jensen, well, here's my view of what took place, and Jensen said, yeah, that's what we were doing. So we're all in agreement. It's this incredibly forceful thing that happened, but almost nobody knows the dynamics behind it. Well, the dynamics behind the change, what makes them happen, is the interesting question. And as you enter into these fields, it's to say, okay, how do I get the dynamics right in order to make the difference that I want to make? And if you get that right, then these powerful things happen. So let's get this right. Now, so this is your job, not mine.
Thanks, Ed.
I also have a question. First of all, thank you so much for sharing all these things with us. I was really interested in sort of, this idea of you don't know what you don't know. So I wanted to ask you to sort of like remember back to when you first started. How did you sort of identify and gather the people and knowledge that you needed back then, not knowing that you necessarily that's exactly what the components were that were going to lead you to what you ended up building?
Well, the first time I think I articulated it to myself was near the end of my 5 years at New York Tech. Where, as I mentioned, I was trying to avoid being a manager. So I had these theories about how to manage. One of them was I only wanted to hire people who could self-manage and were self-motivated. And as I get now into this, after a period of time, I realized, well, actually, that's actually a pretty shallow way of thinking about it. First of all, I can't always tell if somebody is highly self-motivated. But the second is, there are a lot of incredibly bright people. They just need to have some structure and some motivation to go along, and they participate in it. So to say, well, I only want people who work on their own actually was a wrong conclusion. So as I'm thinking about this, I realized, well, actually, I got a bunch of things wrong. And I thought at the time that that's probably going to be true when I go to the next place, is I'm probably just going to get a bunch of things wrong. So it was at that time I said, okay, I'm wrong a third of the time. Now, I have no way of counting what the percentage is. And of course, everybody's heard of the 80-20 rule or the 90-10 rule or whatever rule you want. And nobody will say the 100-0 rule, because it would be too egotistical to say that, because nobody would say I'm never wrong. But a lot of people think they're almost always right. And I believe, no, actually, you need to say I'm probably wrong a third of the time, because I think if you understand that you're wrong more than you think you are, that it helps you open up to listen, because frequently you are wrong. So that was part of this transition, to understand that that a lot of the truth comes from other people, and that when people come, even if I think they might be wrong, then if I listen, then I get two wins from it. One of them is that if I listen, almost everybody's mature enough to know they don't always get their way, but they want the respect of having somebody to listen to them. So if you listen, you're actually respecting somebody, even if in the end you say, we're not going to go that way. But the other is, every once in a while, somebody will come in, and by the time they're done, I'll realize, oh, actually, they know something I don't know, and they're right, and I'm wrong. And I wouldn't know that unless I listened. So that was just part of a reinforcement that went on over a period of time. I kept coming back to this, thinking about how we make it so that other people can participate. I've been very aware of culture. A lot of cultures I see, there's first class and second class. Most people don't use the terminology, but in a lot of engineering-led organizations, the engineers are first class and other people are second class compared to them. And I think it's fundamentally flawed and wrong and counterproductive. And it creeps into organizations. And there are 3 times I've seen it creep into Pixar in spite of our paying a lot of attention to it. And for companies that don't pay attention to it, then it actually becomes very disruptive, and in the long run, bad for the organizations. But I think one has to pay attention to the class structure, which means, for me, one way of asking it is, in any meeting, does the least powerful person in the room feel safe to talk? Do they feel okay? And if the least powerful person feels okay to talk, then if you've made it that way, then you've not only given a message to that person, who's typically early and growing in their career, but the other is for the people who had a lot of experience. It's a message for them also of respect for other people. And the other thing is, recently there have been the issues about systemic biases and of various sorts, and something I've wrestled with and tried to think about, and but there's one time in which I made a mistake. This is like the last few years at Pixar, and when I was talking with the group, now they knew my intention, so I kind of got away with the mistake, but I got 3 telephone calls immediately afterwards saying I had said something which demonstrated my ignorance. And first of all, I was happy that 3 people were immediately willing to call me right away and say I screwed up. So that's good. I always feel good if that happens, because it means I've done something else right. But in thinking it through, I realized that I was trying to get my head in a place where I understood what other people were going through. And what I realized was that I can never be another gender. I can never be another ethnicity, and I can never be raised in another culture, which means that there are experiences that people have that I can never have. But I can have the belief that their experiences are of great value. I may not know what they are. I frequently don't know what they are. But if I can open the door to say that whatever they've got is going to make us better, then I'm just saying I believe that's the case. And once I understood that, then it helped me solidify this, what I think is a problem of people tend to only value what they see. And what we need to do is to value the things that we can't see.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you to everyone for all of your questions. And so I'll turn it over to Dr. Smith now.
Yeah, that was awesome, Ed. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your infinite fount of wisdom and experience. It was a wonderful thing, and I'm sure that we're going to be hearing about your remarks for a while. It was a very memorable thing. So yeah, thank you so much for coming and being our speaker this year. It was awesome.
Well, it's my pleasure. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So thanks everyone for coming. And this is the end of this year's lecture. And we'll see you back next year, or whatever that one brings. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you again, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mr. Catmull. Bye-bye.